If you're using SAP or Oracle ERP, you already know testing is a mess. It's slow, it's expensive, and worst of all, the business users hate it. But there's a better way to do it, and it's called business process focused testing. And it's helping companies cut their testing time and their costs by up to 50%. That's why we're talking about in today's podcast. No buzzwords, no fluff, just what it is, why it works, and how teams are using it to speed up releases without burning out their QA teams and their business teams. I'm your host, David Pickrell, and joining me today is Linda Hayes, the expert in test automation, founder of WorkSoft, visionary in software testing and business process testing. She has helped mid-sized and large enterprises move from broken manual testing to faster, smarter QA using this exact approach. Welcome to the show, Linda, and we look forward to the chat.
Yeah, looking
So
forward. Thanks for having me.
you're welcome. So let's talk about, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Why is SAP testing still so slow, expensive, and dependent on business users, even after all the automation tools that we have in the market today?
Well, it's really just because you're not testing SAP, well, whether or not it works. That's actually SAP's job. You're testing whether or not your business will run using SAP and most likely other applications that are integrated with it. So this is not like a classic QA approach, which is typically, application centric, relies on the software development lifecycle where you get, requirements and designs and test cases and so forth. Instead, what you're verifying is that the way you've configured SAP and any integrated applications will support the business rules and the workflows that drive your business. And only business experts know what your business processes and the data that will trigger those rules. They're the only ones that have that knowledge.
So in that case, how do we accelerate the testing and really drive down the cost?
Well, and like you said, you do it by taking an end-to-end business process approach and deploying that through automation. So in legacy test case execution, you focus on hundreds, probably thousands of individual features and functions. So you work at the business, you identify. So instead of doing that, you're going to work with the business to identify and automate the top level business processes that drive operations. So, let's face it, regardless of the size of the company, in some form or another, they're going to buy stuff, make stuff, sell stuff, collect the money, and then report it. So really, honestly, there's only probably 5 or 10 top-level processes, believe it or not. So things like procure to pay, forecast to stock, order to cash, record a report, you get the picture. Of course, there's lots of variations of each one of these, which depend on the data and the rules that you're triggering. And the reason this is so critical is that if you execute individual test cases, you have to ask the right functional expert to find the transactions and the data in the exact right state for each test that you're going to run. This is just overwhelming for the business because not only will they need to supply the data for all these hundreds or thousands of test cases across, multiple business areas, as soon as that test case executes, that data can't be reused anymore, right? Because the state just changed. So what's cool about end-to-end is that the workflow itself is creating the transactions and modifying the data and the state as it goes. So if you start at the very beginning with the right values, then each succeeding execution component receives what it needs from the previous execution, creates or modifies the data state as it goes, and it passes it to the next component. So it's actually incredibly efficient.
And so it is incredibly complex to do all that. Uh, how do you really help drive and simplify some of that complexity?
Well, so again, you've got these different pathways, right? Each of those processes explodes into a different pathway. So what you're going to do is you're going to approach it based on risk, which, all good testing is risk prioritized. So if you keep this in mind, the goal is not to make sure you can't break the software, right? That's an overwhelming task. What you're really trying to do is make sure that you don't break the business, right? So that the key business processes that drive operations, that drive your business are still going to work. All right. Now, again, these flows may span other applications, some of which might be in SAP or some that aren't. And so, of course, you need to make sure that your execution, which means your automation platform, will execute seamlessly across all those. And then finally, what's driving all this is data. That's bottom line, right? The data is dynamic. It's going to make these business rules trigger and the workflows change.
And so, other than starting with master data so that you're driving from the beginning, or how do you really help the users get the data, show you how to get the data and get it one time so you can incorporate that or replicate that as you're creating automation?
Well, so usually what people do, honestly, is they go run and ask the business to give it to them, right? Give me some data
Right.
for what I'm doing here. And of course, they're the ones that know. But the problem is that because the data is dynamic, right? The data they give you today is not going to work tomorrow. Right? All the stuff changes, materials, products, pricing, customer suppliers, data, blah, blah, blah. It's all going to change over time. And as the business itself changes. So what you're going to do is instead of asking them to give you the data, you're going to ask them to show you how they get it. Because that's what's going to happen, obviously, right? You go ask them for data, they're going to go look for it. They don't have it on their head. So they're going to go do some searches and browsing and come back and say, okay, here's some data that'll work. So it's like that saying, don't give me a fish, teach me to fish.
Hmm.
So you're going to ask the business and say, show me how you get this data. And then you're going to automate that.
And so, then that doesn't that require more training on your automation team? Or is it more that your automation team kind of has a general understanding of the business process? They can ask the right questions. They can ask the business users, show me how you get that data, and then they can incorporate that in the test versus maybe in the older days, I'll say, the automation team waited for people to tell them what to do. Does that question make sense?
Well, exactly. So that's what you're going to do. So think about it. When you're automating a test, you're automating the steps that the user would go through manually to run that test, right? So really, you're just adding one more dimension to that and saying, I'm also going to automate the steps that the business user would take to go get the data. Because they do. If you watch a business person run a manual test case, that's exactly what they do. They go find the data, they run the test case. So that's what you're going to automate. So you're just going to expand the scope of that automation. And the beautiful part of that is that, it's teach me once, run it many. So now once I learn that, it's incorporated into my automation. And yeah, as an automation person, I'm going to learn over time, but I'm not having to ask each time, right? I'm incorporating that into my automation. It's getting more and more robust.
Good, good. So then what about validation of the data? Since the data is always dynamic, I'm beginning with maybe different data, and my test case has to validate that I'm getting the right answer. Again, how do I kind of ensure that validation and I don't have to go chasing down a business person for that? Does that make sense?
It does, and that's a huge problem, by the way, because and what's cool is that if you solve that problem, you're also going to solve another problem, which is how to get the business to trust the automation. Okay, and that's not simple, by the way. A lot of them are like, because they're going to put their name on this and they're going to roll it into production, and they're going to be on the line if it doesn't work. So you got to get them to trust the automation that it's going to do what they would do. So the solution is that you can't validate, individual field by field and step by step, because that's a career, right? You could take one end-to-end test case could have, tens of thousands, and I've actually had those of different steps and fields and, at validation. So what you're going to do is you're going to have the business process flow that you run. when it executes, it's going to create documents, right? That's the end result for any business process. It's going to create invoices or payments or whatever. So at the beginning, what you'll do is you'll say, okay, we just ran this end-to-end process. Here's the documents that were produced. And at the beginning, what they'll do is, and I've worked with them to do this. They'll take the documents, they'll go look at the document flow, they'll poke around and look at the documents that created that flow, and see if they look right. Okay, that's what they'll do. Sometimes they might want screenshots and steps, but usually they only want those if something doesn't look right. Okay, they'll go, huh, that didn't look right. Let me go see what happened on that screen. They'll want to see a screenshot. But actually, once they do that a while, and I've actually been in projects where by the time we got their confidence, all they really did truly was go look at the general ledger entries, right? Which is the final outcome.
Right.
And if those look good, they passed on it, right? And if not, then they started drilling down. So, they're going to do some spot checks. Again, if something looks wonky, they're going to dig into it. But other than that, you get it down to that, and then it's very, very efficient. And to think about it, there's a lot of data along the way that you have to validate, and your test can do that, but the business person doesn't have to do that, because if what you're doing is working, the final result will be correct.
Ah, so one of the challenges, and this is probably one of the things that I see, particularly in the SAP market, is the SIs and customers doing having thousands of manual tests, and they feel like those have got to be used, otherwise it's doesn't validate. How do you get around, or how do you change the behavior from the age old, we have to create a manual test, we got 1,000 manual test cases either in ALM or solution manager or someplace else, to this business process focused testing approach?
Well, it's like most things, right? It starts with education, which is to say, and I know exactly what you're talking about. So almost all these companies have some kind of test management system. And over time and over multiple releases and patches and fixes and all that, they've written all these test cases, they've put them in there, and they've just piled up, right? Thousands of them. And they cling to them, right? And
Yes.
What So what you have to educate them on is to say, "Hey, look, you see this test case here, right? That test case is really part of a business process, right? Because it is. It has to be.
Hmm. Hmm.
And as we said earlier, if you sort of roll those up, and the number of top level business processes is a much smaller number. So that's number one, is just to let them see we're not throwing these away. They're there. It's just, where are they, right? They're now incorporated into a single flow. And the reason that's important is because that flow makes sure not just that that test case individually will run, but that it actually runs seamlessly with everything that comes before and after it, right? Because that's the real validation. I might get one test case to work, but if it doesn't work in conjunction with the data flowing into it and out of it, then I don't have, it's not working. So you have to get them to see that, and then they're not, these people aren't stupid. I mean, they're going to get it, right? You're going to show that to them, and they'll say, "Oh, okay, yeah, right." In fact, I'll give you a real quick example. We had a project, and they said, "Oh, we need to automate," and this was a fairly small project, just to be clear. We need to automate these 900 test cases. Actually, a little over 900. Okay. So we did is went and looked at them and sorted them down based on the T codes that were there and the fields that were involved and all that. It turned out there were 68, count them, 68 unique test cases. Everything else was just data variations. That's the only thing that went from 68 to 900 and something. And then once we showed them that, and then we said, now the way we get those, all those data variations is that top level data, right? The data, the master data that we choose, is going to drive what these, and the transaction data that we're going to specify is what's going to drive those variations. The light bulb goes off and then you're ready to go.
It's so then to summarize, we really take a top down approach, but it also seems to me like we've got to incorporate a pretty significant educational process with the business users so they quickly trust that this automated testing is going to cover the things that they're really worried about, as opposed to kind of our traditional automation approach of you tell me what I need to test and I'll go create the automation. So it sounds like there's a lot of change management and behavior understanding that needs to go into these projects.
There is, and it's like most education, right? You have to motivate them. Right. They have to see what's in it for me. I'm doing it this way. Why would I change? And the way that you do that is that, and they, like I said, these people are smart and they're overwhelmed. I was on a project where the business people seriously double, triple, quadruple booked, right? So we were groveling to get their attention.
Hmm.
But what we pointed out to him is to say, and for example, we took this particular one of these business case flows that was, back to the 900 down to 68 and so forth, had 98 touch points. 98. Now it crossed multiple applications to be fair, right? Still, there's 98 of them. So for them to run this manually, because, they had to trade off between different users that had different roles that were in different business areas, so it was like a ping pong game just to get the transactions done. It would take them about 2 weeks to run one, just to take one of those scenarios, excuse me, and run it into. So when we validated it, when we automated it, it ran in under 2 hours. So that was compelling, right? And then at that point, the light bulb goes off and they go, oh, okay, that's cool. That's going to save me a lot of time. Um, and then once you set the hook, right, this is what's in it for you, then they start to want to spend time with you. In fact, that's what happened on this project. We would invite them. They would not show up, not show up, not show up. And then finally, once it clicked, then they moved us to the top of the list, right? We started to get their attention.
So management is always, and companies are focused on reducing their overall cost of testing. I've been involved in a number of kind of ECC to S4 transformations where the manual testing cost is in the millions of dollars. So does this approach, can it really cut the cost, time, effort by 30 to 50%?
Yeah, at least, right? And
Okay.
as you move through different iterations, it's going to save more and more because up front you do have the investment. Let's be clear, right? We've got to get the education. We've got to learn how to get the data. We have to get their comfort in the execution. So that's an investment you're going to make, but you get that payback over and over and over again. So let's look at the typical project, right? You go through the development phase. Okay, and there's going to be some amount of testing that goes on in that environment. And then you're going to move to the QA environment, right, where they're going to, again, run those tests again. And by the way, the data changes between those environments. So there's that whole data thing. And then you're going to go to pre-prod, right? Whole thing's going to happen again. All the data, all the tests, et cetera. So you look at that and you look at those kind of ratios, right? 2 weeks to 2 hours. And that's assuming again everything works, which of course, that's the reason we test. It may not. We got to run them again. That impact of that collapsing of the timeline and removing the burden from your most valuable resources is staggering. It really is. We've never had trouble getting management to get that ever. I mean, it doesn't take a lot, right? You're not dumb. You show it to them. You might need to do a business case to illustrate it, but they get it. In fact, I'll be honest, some of the problems we've had is not getting them to buy in. It's that they're maybe a little bit over enthusiastic, right? They think it's magic.
Hmm.
It's all going to happen just magically. So we all have to be practical about it. But as long as we're clear about what the steps are and who does what, and we have the right, sequence of events laid out and everybody understands what their role is, then, it absolutely works.
That's and we're always circling back to the same, almost the same construct, and that is the business users who are and the functional team that are having to really provide information about the business process, et cetera. They are the big winner in the test automation process, the business first test automation process approach. And that's really who has to buy in and promote that within their companies. Is that kind of a fair statement?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the business is the winner because they get high quality releases faster. I mean, people don't install changes to their software for entertainment, right? They do that because there's some business value that they want to derive from that, whether that's new products or new processes or, new versions that are going to give them other efficiency. So they want that benefit. The faster you can give it to them, the sooner they get it. And the less resources that it takes to do that, then the lower their cost.
Perfect. Perfect. So if I'm a head of QA or a CIO and I'm intrigued by this, what's the best way to really get started? How do you kind of try it, et cetera?
Well, it's like most things, right? You do a pilot.
Right?
And so, go pick a business process. And then what I would do is I would take their test cases that this pile of test cases that they have, thousands of them, take a business process, map those over, right? Show them how many would be covered in that process. And by the way, a lot of times you don't even need the business to give you the individual steps for those business processes. Those are in those test cases, right? So I just say, okay, it's sort of like Legos. Okay, here's a T code, here's a T code, here's a T code. I've already got all that documented. I'm just going to sort of, automate these components. I'm going to string them together. Then we're going to talk about the data. And so, you do one um, and walk them through the steps and how that's going to work. And then you show them the outcome. So that's the most compelling. Now, some companies that might be in a hurry, we've been with those, and they might accept that from another company, right? There might be a case study or somebody that they know that you could introduce them to, or somebody that you worked with. They can give them their own experience, and they might accept that sometimes. But if not, you show it in their environment with their data and their processes.
Okay. And so let's touch on tools for a minute. I know you're the founder of WorkSoft, and that Certify is one of the more advanced tools in this space. Are there others? I mean, talk to me a minute about the tools and kind of how you deploy all this.
Well, so again, you just given my background, this should not be a surprise, but I have never been successful or seen success seriously with writing code to test code. So, for example, people will say, "Oh, but Selenium is free, and look, I can write my own framework." Yeah, yeah, of course you can. But the key there is that you're basically building your own framework, which means you're writing your own code. And by the way, you'll end up with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lines of code by the time it's over. I'll give you a real quick example. I was on a project where there was a point of sale system and integrated 17 different inputs to it. So 17 different workflows, things like inventory, like pricing, like customer management, like transactions, like payments. I mean, all that stuff came together in this one application, and they decided to use Selenium because, hey, it's free. Uh, they ended up with, count them, 18 different frameworks, one for each work stream and one for the point of sale system itself. And so, I mean, this may sound like a trivial example, but really you should meditate on this. Of course, every application, they're web-based. They use kind of the same, class library. So, they've got buttons and tabs and input fields and so on and so forth. Every single one of those frameworks had the code in there to, let's say, push a button. So the company paid for developers to write that code 18 times. Yeah, and go from there, right? The average web app has between 12 and 17 different classes in it. So, and then the crazy thing was it as they all came together, right? All 17 fed into the point of sale system itself. The point of sale system, because of the way that it needed to have performance at the client level, was actually a thick client. And so the web stuff, the Selenium library wouldn't work for most of it, just certain windows inside of it. But the overall architecture was actually a Java GUI. So they had to have yet another tool that integrated all that. So they had two different, technologies, 18 different frameworks. You get the idea. Uh, so, so what Worksoft is built on the premise that is that code is completely reusable. There's no reason for everybody to push buttons in code, right? So what Worksoft gives you is a data approach, which if you think about it, every other application on the planet, right? The purpose of the application is to shield the user from the technology. There's a front end, the user's, it's user friendly, it's easy to understand and use, it's consistent, and then all the code is actually written, it's in the background, it's something that you buy. And so Worksoft is that same premise, which is there's a front end, it's drag and drop, point and click, it's based on a database. And no matter how many test cases you write, the amount of data doesn't, the amount of code doesn't change, as opposed to a code-based framework, which, every test case turns into code. And the other thing it does is it's technology agnostic. So whether it's web or a thick client or a web service or SAP, doesn't matter. The UI and the test case and the data are all completely identical. So it lets you write end-to-end cases that span different applications and technologies seamlessly.
So that's a really critical point. I think the when you take the business process for most enterprises today, while we talk a lot about SAP, there's often four, five, six, eight other applications embedded in that end-to-end business process. And so if I understand correctly, what you're telling me is I take Worksoft, I have one tool that spans all of those technologies, that begins with whatever the start of the business process is and ends with the close of the business process. So I can now do what some people refer to as value stream testing, but I'm focused on that whole end-to-end process, irrespective of the underlying technology. Is that
Exactly.
okay?
And honestly, most SAP ecosystems, most companies, most global enterprises, even, mid-range, do you look at their application inventory? It's in the hundreds. Seriously.
Yes.
Yeah, they may not all be integrated into high-level business processes, but there's a bunch. So yeah, exactly. You have a uniform structure, a centralized database. You're not chasing code in a bunch of different code libraries. Just to put the, final stake in the heart of those those code-based libraries. Seriously, that's code. So that means it's the code library. You've got to have a source code management tool. It means you have to do code reviews, right? So you do the peer-to-peer review, then you do the final review, then you do the integration test. It's a development project. So you basically are having a development project in the middle of the test cycle. So like I
Right. So
said,
you got a whole SDLC process laid on top of the testing process,
exactly.
which now just gets really complex. So the other thing that I see is seems to me that this kind of approach would work very, very well for agile and CI/CD integration. So I think about the SAP projects where you come out of development and you go into set one, set two, set three, and then UAT. Would seem to me that this business process first approach would work incredibly well for eliminating a lot of manual testing in early SIP, the system integration testing 1, 2, and 3. What are your thoughts there?
Well, exactly. And like we were saying earlier, as I go through different phases, I'm also typically going through different environments, where the data is dynamic and so forth. So yeah, and you can build on it clearly, right? I could have different scopes in each one of those. And if you do it through the business process approach, each of that scope is really probably just additional data. You're probably not writing any new test cases.
And so therein again lies the value in the savings, the reduction of cost, the reduction of, quite frankly, the need for your most critical resource, which are your business subject matter experts.
Exactly.
So, any other particular comments that you want to that occur to you? You want to comment on other kinds of general topics in this business first approach, business first process approach?
Well, I want to quote one of the VPs on this particular project that he was managing the business experts that were the functional and business experts in this area, and we were of course asking for their time, and he made the comment. He said, "Look, right now they are writing the requirements for the next project, right? And if we don't give them time for that, there won't be a next project. You won't have anything to test." And we said, "True, but if we don't test this project, you can't get to that project, right?" And so it took, as we said, it took the education, and I think this is where it all goes to, right? Is it has to be understood as a collaborative effort between the business. That automation is viewed not as a silo that's going to somehow come in and take the testing and move it somewhere else, that it's a support function, that you're supporting the business and you're supporting the not only the business but the users that are trying to get all their jobs done, and that you're part of that team and you're showing them how you're going to make their job easier, faster, cheaper, and get the business to achieve its high level objectives, which is the functionality that's going to be available to them once they get the software installed. And once you move that to that level and get out of all the, test cases and test tools and that lower level sort of, noise that nobody really understands and wants to talk about, then you really, really can get the focus and the right resources and the right results.
So one other, so if these tools, and particularly maybe certified, are very easy to use, can the business users actually create their test? Is that a viable strategy?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So this is what we've discovered at WorkSoft is that we have a tool called Business Capture. Excuse me, it's exactly what it sounds like. So the business person can sit down and turn this on and carry out whatever test case or business process or whatever it is that they would do manually. This tool captures that into a format that can be imported into WorkSoft. So they don't have to sit and document it and, do all the steps in ALM or some other tool, right? It collapses all that. But just to be clear, that for automation to be efficient and maintainable, you need to have it in a reusable format. So they may write it, they may do a test, but then when it comes into WorkSoft, an automation engineer will look at it and go, okay, we see what's going on here, but we have to identify that this particular data, it's a constant because we're always going to be, choosing this particular option. But the rest of this data is variable. And if we change that data, we'll trigger a different business rule. So they will convert what the business user did into a component that's reusable, okay, that can take dynamic data, that can be reused for different flows. So it takes both of them. But again, just to collapse the need for the business person to, laboriously, document each one of these individual steps, they can just sit down and do it, right? Just get it done.
So we've covered a lot of, I think, really critical and important information today. the big takeaway to me here is simple. The QA teams and the user teams need to think about this in a very collaborative way. They need tools and capabilities that make it easy to test the business process. And then they need to focus on the business process and how do I test that as a instead of how do I create a manual test case to test one small piece of functionality. And if I do that, then I'm changing the whole mindset and I'm actually going to drive very rapid tests that test automated testing that is both agile and can be incorporated into their CI/CD pipelines. Is that a fair summary?
That's an excellent summary.
Okay. Well, thank you, Linda, very much for joining us today. We look forward to continuing this conversation.
I look forward to that.
Okay. Thanks.
All right.